So I'm really pleased now to move on to Susan Hawthorne. Susan Hawthorne is from Australia. She's a poet, a writer, and a political commentator. She's co-founder and director of independent feminist publisher Spinifex Press, who's another signatory organisation of the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights. Susan's going to talk to us about her new book, Vortex, The Crisis of Patriarchy. So thank you so much, Susan. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I feel really honoured to be here and be part of this. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from Jiru land in far north Queensland. I acknowledge that their relationship with the land has extended over many thousands of years, and as Elder Lilla Watson said back in 1984, for Aboriginal peoples, the future extends as far forward as the past. That's a very long and far-sighted plan, way more than a 5-year plan. If we can last the next 65,000 years, I think the Earth will be safe. The initial prompt for writing Vortex, and I didn't make slides, but that's a picture of my book, were requests from 2 publishers to write a short version of my earlier book, Wild Politics, Feminism, Globalization and Biodiversity. And that's that one, which was published back in 2002. But as I wrote, the book changed shape. In Vortex, I highlight the ways in which patriarchy destroys lives and destroys the planet. The word vortex has a twofold meaning. In an environmental context, it is the empty centre of a mass of air or water into which objects are drawn. So think of a cyclone or a tornado. In a literary sense, it is a dangerous or bad situation which you can't escape. Sounds familiar? These 2 meanings encapsulate where we stand in catastrophic neoliberal patriarchy. A key concept I follow throughout the book is the Trojan Horse. The Trojan Horse in ancient Greece is a story about trickery by Odysseus and the patriarchal Greeks, pretending to make an offering, a good thing, to the matrilineal Trojans. The Greeks had been fighting the Trojans for 10 long years. They had their ships on the beach below the walled city of Troy. The idea for the Trojan horse was cooked up by Odysseus, and the Greeks built a huge wooden horse and set it up outside the gates of Troy. They then sailed away in their ships. The Trojans, thinking it was a goodwill gesture from the departing Greeks, wheeled the horse through the impassable gates into the city. But that wooden horse was filled with Greek soldiers who burnt and routed the city of Troy once darkness fell. It's also the story of Cassandra, who is the daughter of the king and the queen. She predicted this and told her father, King Priam, not to bring the horse inside the walls, as it would end in disaster, but she was not believed. When she was a child, a snake had licked her ears, which enabled her to prophesy. It was a gift from the patriarchal god Apollo. But after spurning Apollo's sexual advances and threats of rape during the Trojan War, he put a curse on her so that even though she prophesied accurately, no one would ever believe her. The Trojan horse is the trickery used by the neoliberals, whether it's saying sex work is a job, the promise of technological fixes for people with a disability or for transgenders, development touted as progress for the landless, the colonised and those in poverty, the false solutions offered by climate deniers whose solutions exacerbate the problems. Cassandra's voice is that of all the women who have been disbelieved when they report a rape. All the lesbians whose suffering, including torture, corrective rape and murder, has been erased. Cassandra is the woman, including me as author, saying over and over again, listen, This is important. In both Vortex and Wild Politics, I address the issue of the destruction of ecological systems, and I try to come up with ways that they might be stopped. Feminism was central to my analysis, and my theoretical base in Wild Politics is feminist economics, ecofeminist theory, radical feminist theories of power, and the different ways in which women's work is not accounted. I did not have whole chapters on sexual violence, prostitution, and the torture of lesbians, as I do in Vortex. Women and the earth in patriarchal ideology are seen as passive for the use of men and male systems. Too bad if we are injured or if we die. We are also seen as endlessly fruitful and best kept subdued, pregnant, or in the case of the earth, endlessly producing crops, milk, meat, timber, and fossil fuels. This don't care attitude is resulting in huge numbers of women killed by partners or family members. 50,000 globally in 2018, according to a UN report for that year. And mass death of corals, devastating bushfires, flooding of rivers. Just in the last week, there was a glacier melt in India, which caused flooding, and ever-intensifying storms, cyclones, and other climate-related catastrophes. One way of thinking about solutions, there is no one-size-fits-all solution, is to shift from a culture in which money is the inspiration to one in which biodiversity is the inspiration. Instead of profit, a thriving, biodiverse, eco-social system is what we need. Biodiversity is a complex, self-sustaining system of an ecological niche in a particular locale. The details cannot be universalized, but the behaviors that sustain it can be. If biodiversity is your inspiration, then you can't drop bombs, you can't engage in industrial farming, fishing, and forestry, you can't support surrogacy, prostitution, reproductive technologies, and other fake advances are not possible. Nor is a trans ideology of what Jennifer Bilek calls the transhumanist death cult. And that's not possible either. The principle of biodiversity is very like the principle of the personal is political. Use the local, the personal to inform your actions, but don't make the mistake of homogenizing, which is a behavior of disconnection. The trans ideologues have perverted the word diversity in their propaganda, since what they want is old-fashioned masculine and feminine sex stereotypes. In the neoliberal world, every technological failure is a new business opportunity. In the end, it will result in spiraling failure. The other aspect is constant vigilance about language distortion and erasure, being alert to appropriation and trickery, and constantly and loudly speaking out about these deranged philosophies. One of the surprises that emerged from my research for Vortex was the crossover of funders among climate deniers and environmental vandals, with funders of decriminalisation of prostitution and the transgenderism lobbyists. Among the climate profiteers are Monsanto Bayer, now one, just called Bayer because Monsanto has such a bad reputation, who on the 8th of January this year put out a statement about inclusivity and diversity. This is a quote from Bayer, Monsanto. Blend is the name of a global community at Bayer that was set up by the LGBTI employees and other supporters. Can you believe it? Their latest is to participate in Christopher Street protests wearing Bayer t-shirts. It's so extraordinary to me that they think a homogenized word like blend would be a great marketing idea. They should go and read The Lathe of Heaven by Ursula Le Guin and find out a bit more. But also it's extraordinary to me that the marchers find it acceptable to have representatives of an environmentally destructive company parading corporate T-shirts, while in so many pride marches, lesbians and radical feminists are vilified and booted out. So going on to the other funders, Warren Buffett and Bill Gates are on one another's foundation boards. They're both taken to task by Vandana Shiva and Kartikeya Shiva in their book Oneness versus the 1% for their environmentally destructive financial and business ventures, in which they pretend to be philanthropists. Remember the Trojan Horse. It's no longer religious offerings, it's money offerings. Buffett's main commodity trade is cotton. In Australia, we've seen immensely destructive use of water from a river system, the Darling River system, now limping from one disaster to another. Warren Buffett is the father of Peter Buffett, who runs the pro-transgender Novo Foundation, handing out money to organisations who used to be run by and for LGBT people, and now simply spruik and fund the spread of the transgender ideology. Again, the Trojan Horse, and astroturfing. If you don't know what astroturfing is, think about how grass becomes fake grass, plastic grass. Well, astroturfing is grassroots become billionaire fake grassroots. So the LGBTIQA plus acronym is a key to all of this. The other name that comes up over and over in the funding of decriminalisation of sex work and the transgender ideology and law change is George Soros. The Soros Foundation's OSF has connections to Pfizer and Monsanto, that's now Bayer, and they do a lot of effective lobbying of governments. John Stryker and trans lesbian Colonel Jennifer James Pritzker and his relatives are among the others. They are massive funders of LGBTQA plus organisations. Penny Pritzker, a cousin of Colonel James Jennifer, worked in the Obama administration, and their foundation donated $25 million to Obama's childhood initiatives. So if you're wondering where the Biden changes to the Equality Act have come from, look no further. The state of the environment affects all of us in small ways and large. In Australia, this was made eerily apparent when the bushfires roared through from October 2019 to March 2020, during which time 18.6 million hectares were burnt. That's a massive amount of land. 34 people died, and around about 1 billion native animals also died. Grief at the state of the country was widespread. So was the sense that the Prime Minister was not only negligent, but also an abettor of the disaster through his government's policies. Indigenous peoples have been crying out for better fire management systems for years, what is called a cool burn. Women, especially feminists, have been at the forefront of the environmental movement. Think Rachel Carson and her book, Silent Spring. In Australia, think of Judith Wright, who was the key activist against the installation of oil wells in the Great Barrier Reef in the 1970s and protecting this extraordinary, huge biodiverse region. See her book, The Coral Battleground. Think Maria Mies and Vandana Shiva, their individual and combined work on linking women and the environment. See Maria's The Village and the World, but also Vandana's Staying Alive, Seeding Sovereignty, and many others. Think Farida Akhtar, whose work in Bangladesh focuses precisely on access to good health services for women, creating dowry-free and pesticide-free farming communities. See her books, Depopulating Bangladesh, Women and Trees, and Seeds of Movements. Think Suzanne Simard's work on the ways in which plants communicate, how trees use fungi and huge underground root networks to sustain one another. And I could go on for hours. There are many, many more women who could be named. The environmental movement would not exist without the ideas and actions of women, but so often the women are left out of the histories. In recent times, Green parties in the UK, Australia, New Zealand, probably elsewhere, have more than forgotten this history. They are in the process of erasing it altogether so that even speaking of it becomes taboo. And while there are many good women who've been involved over the years, the women inside the Greens now have to ensure that they do not speak like a radical feminist. I'm not a party joiner because I never felt that they would speak for me. The Australian Greens, I've been reading their policies, and they support sex as work, and they support inclusivity. They are not at the top of their list, and you have to read quite far down to see it. Most Greens these days have become neoliberal Greens, just as the feminists who get media attention are neoliberal feminists in the main. A number of high-profile people have resigned from the Greens. Beatrix Campbell, with whom I've not always agreed, resigned from the UK Green Party in July 2020. And she said that if the meaning of woman is emptied out, how can we address the fact that women everywhere in the world are put upon, discriminated against, oppressed, underpaid, unpaid, raped and disrespected because they're women? Andy Reitman, Scottish MP, also resigned recently. In both these instances and in New Zealand and Australia, the battle is over trans. The 2016 non-men of the UK Greens I found extraordinary. And then there's the slippage from women to trans women, which makes it impossible for any of us to fight for the rights of women when any day, at any time, any man can become a woman, with his rights much more protected than those of us born women. No one wants an oppression Olympics, but one simple test lies in the statistics on the murders of women and trans women. In 2018 in the UK, Karen Ingela Smith put out a report on the murders of trans women. In a decade, there were 7. Let me repeat that, 7 in 10 years, as against around 1,000 women murdered in the same decade. Furthermore, there were more homicides perpetrated by biologically male trans people against biologically male trans people. That is, trans women against trans women. And trans people are perpetrators of homicide at 71% greater rates than they are victims. Do look up her site at www.kareningelasmith.com. To return to where I started talking about the environmental groups and asking whether there can be alliances between them and radical feminists, gender critical feminists, lesbian feminists, my answer is no, if they support inclusivity as one of their policies, and that seems to be the norm for Greens wherever they are. You have to look hard to find environmental groups worth joining. My advice is to start your own autonomous groups, as we did, especially in the 1970s and 80s. Only then can you be sure that your voice is heard and that your message is clear. One of the areas of my book that's very different from other books that critique patriarchy, capitalism, environmental disasters, and the neoliberal global system is a chapter I have called Colonisation, Erasure and Torture, Wars Against Lesbians. There are a few books that deal with lesbians on a global level. And as poet Gillian Hanscom writes, only other dykes are proud of dykes. And I would add, only other dykes care about dykes. I write about the ways in this chapter in which violence against lesbians is ignored or minimised, from Amnesty International reports, not a big surprise there, through to history books about the Nazi regime, even books about Ravensbrück, or books about rape in South Africa in which corrective rape of lesbians is left out. But when lesbians write, you get to set the record straight. Sorry, no pun intended. I recommend to you an essay by Consuelo Rivera Fuentes and Linda Burke. It's called Talking with/in Pain, Reflections of Bodies Under Torture, and was published in 2001 in Women's Studies International Forum. In this essay, Consuelo writes about her experiences under the Pinochet regime in Chile in the 1970s. Linda draws Consuelo out in a difficult discussion. The question Consuelo asks is, where is my I? Where is my lesbian I? Consuelo writes, I am terrified that my body will betray me. Within heterosexual discourse, the lesbian epitomizes the body untrammeled. The lesbian body is perceived as a body out of control. It's ungoverned by heteropatriarchal rules. For the torturer, the prisoner's body has also become a body out of control, and this lack of control is shown each time pain is inflicted. The ability to dissociate so that lesbians don't count is the same dissociation that occurs when the planet doesn't count. The prisoner of torture is considered out of control. The lesbian is out of control. The tortured lesbian is therefore doubly out of control. And in a society where lesbians are defined as mentally ill, triply out of control. Since she's so clearly out of control, anything that happens to her is her fault, because if she chose to behave differently, she would not be tortured. Sorry, I just lost my spot. The torturer, the male sexual fantasist pornographer, is therefore able to abandon all sense of responsibility for his actions and for his beliefs about lesbians. It's in her interest that he torture her, rape her, show just how good he is. Or, as Elaine Scarry writes in her amazing book, The Body in Pain, every weapon has two ends. In converting the other person's pain into his own power, the torturer experiences the entire occurrence exclusively from the non-vulnerable end of the weapon. Throughout the period of writing Vortex, I also wanted to keep asking, where is my lesbian I? Where is the centrality of my lesbian being? Where is my experience as a lesbian recorded and recognised? The conversation between Consuelo and Linda is not an easy read, but it is essential reading. In addition to writing about Consuelo, I also cover the horrors of corrective rape, of levels of violence against Roma lesbians, the targeting of activists like Adoronte Apata from Nigeria and Fanny Ann Eddy from Sierra Leone, because they are lesbians. They were targeted. In Iran, so much shame is attached to being a lesbian that even refugee activists don't think lesbians are important enough to protest against their murder and torture. It is difficult to know very much about instances such as torture or murder or the numbers of lesbian refugees when no one is looking. Victoria Brownworth has been recording women's stories in the USA, the women who are being murdered, lesbians murdered. And Giti Tadani wrote about that in her book, in Sakiyani, which was published in 1996, a book about India. And with so many lesbian men around these days, the statistics become ever more distorted. But see my point above about the very low numbers of murders of trans women and the very high numbers of murders of women. So one of the questions I was asked was, what were my future projects? Well, Renata Klein and I have a wonderful project we're working on at the moment, which is an anthology. I need something happy, you know, after this, called Not Dead Yet. And it has around about 60 contributors of 70 years of age or older. And it's a wonderful history of the women's liberation movement and history of the 20th to 21st century. It'll be out in July 2021. For my own individual work, spending some three years on Vortex, I don't really feel like writing much at present. Of course, I am still to some extent, and I'm speaking in a number of places about my work. I haven't had a good idea for a poem for a while. I have the germ of an idea for a novel, but maybe it'll turn into a long poem instead. But in time, these things will come. With big projects, I never know where it will take me until I start. But I'll keep on keeping on, persisting and trying to stay ahead of the game. I was also asked to let you know where you can buy Vortex. For starters, go to the Spinifex Press website, which is www.spinifexpress.com.au. And there you'll find all the information that you need. If you go to the section called Order, you'll find where to get it in the UK and Europe, and that's from Gazelle Book Services, which is gazellebookservices.co.uk, and they're based in Lancaster. And in the US, Canada, and Mexico, you can get books from www.ipgbook.com, and they're in Chicago. So if you order from the Spinifex page, you can, but you'll pay postage. So if the UK and the US are nearer to you, then check out those places. Thank you very much. I've been very pleased to speak tonight.
Thank you so much, Susan. That's completely brilliant and really interesting, very comprehensive sort of overview of a lot of what's been written by feminists and environmentalists, and a sort of modernization, sort of bringing it all up to date with what's happening now. So Spinifex Books, I think many of you know them. They have a fantastic catalogue, back catalogue of books. So that's also worth looking at.
Lierre, it's really good that you raised that issue of why population control is a bad thing. Really, what's far more important is the control of consumption. About 2 decades ago, when I read these statistics, people in the US were consuming 39 times the amount that anybody in, say, Bangladesh or India were consuming. So let's start by reducing our consumption by 39 times, getting it down. And in fact, it was one of the good things that came out of the pandemic, was that there weren't as many cars, there weren't as many planes, there a big reduction in lots of activity, which actually was very good for the planet. However, the minute that people are allowed out again, consumption really skyrocketed. The other thing I thought that was interesting in what you were talking about, Lierre, was the history of agriculture and so forth. And I absolutely agree with you that agriculture did bring with it war and so forth. But there are many people, many groups of people around the world who have engaged in agriculture who didn't do that. I mean, in Australia, for example, Indigenous people have actually been doing agriculture for at least 30,000 years, possibly many tens of thousands of years more, but they didn't use it as a way to conquer somebody else. They used it in a mix, in with a mix of other things that they did. So I think that the other thing is the connection to the images you showed of women, from 30 odd thousand years ago and so forth. I think that's a really interesting point to make. And I have a small section in Vortex about prehistory and how that's connected to what I'm writing about, and the need for us to decolonize, deindustrialize, degrow, all of those things need to happen. I don't know how it's going to happen, but oh boy, it's certainly an urgent thing to have happen.